That's a horrible way to intro this video.
I saw the sound levels just spike straight away.
Oh, war's over, Josh Brown. Have you seen the news?
I've seen the news. I read it in the papers. What's happening? There's been a truce between Xbox and PlayStation, has there,
Yes,
Scott?
but one of them went for the handshake and then went and then they're actually going through with it. But the other party can't do anything about it. Turns out the 20-plus-year-old console war between Xbox and PlayStation is over. If you're into that sort of thing, me and you definitely used to be. I think a lot of people who grew up tended to put an alliance with a certain console and get stuck into the console wars. And I know obviously it persisted a good long time. A lot of people online still aligning themselves to certain consoles and certain ways of thinking, etc. But that stuff is done now. Almost a year ago to the day, we've had various key first-party Xbox games announced on their way to PlayStation, also including an official announcement surrounding last year's Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, one of Xbox's key exclusives for 2024. Xbox's Phil Spencer followed up saying that there are no red lines on which titles could then make the leap, and since we've had rumors that everything from Starfield to Gears of War and even Halo could be on PlayStation by the end of 2025. Now, in a new interview with Xbox Era, Phil Spencer confirmed Starfield is no longer an exclusive and that the company are now essentially a giant third-party publisher now, not unlike what happened to Sega at the start of the 2000s. Spencer said they're done trying to move players over to Xbox anymore. We're also invested in where our games are. Let's just allow more people to play. And yes, the 70% that we make on games on other platforms is helpful to us being able to build great portfolios. There are people, whether it's their libraries are on PlayStation or Nintendo, whether it's that they like the controller better, or just that the games are there, I don't want to then look at that and say, well, there's no way we should be able to not build a business there or find fans of our franchises there. There's a little bit more here, but I do think it's hilarious to try this mass sweep of buy-ups, what we all found out during the legal proceedings surrounding the Activision Blizzard acquisition, where this is the same guy that wanted to buy Nintendo and wanted to own everything. And then it's like, just let people play, just share and share alike, don't worry about it.
Well, here's the thing, I don't really know what you think about this overall move, Scott, but I am personally happy to just kind of draw a line under it and move on into this new era of Xbox being, like you said, the biggest third-party publisher going forward, because I do think that Activision acquisition just completely changed the company, and whether that was intentional by Phil's plan for like the long term of Xbox, or whether it was something that came from Microsoft, I suppose at this point doesn't matter. This is the Xbox that we have going forward, and this is the future that they're paving. They're paving, all of their games, Starfield, Indiana Jones, Doom, whatever it is, to go to every console and every space possible to maximize that revenue. Because at this point, Xbox is tumbling when it comes to console sales. They don't even have the install base that they used to. I think they said they were 28% down on hardware sales in comparison to last year, and they expect that to keep going down. Whereas Sony, on the other hand, for instance, they just had their reports where PlayStation 5 is doing very well, contrary to what some reports were indicating last year. Okay. They have said that they've sold now 75 million machines. So if you're Xbox and you're trying to recoup that Activision cost, and you're trying to make a profit on some of the biggest games in the industry, like Call of Duty, like the stuff that Blizzard puts out, you want, I guess, the maximum install base possible. And to ignore, I guess, 75 million players, perhaps, I know it won't be that exact number because a lot of us have more than one consoles, but it is more than on Xbox. And if you're looking at the spreadsheet and you're seeing that number go down of hardware sales, and you want the Call of Duty number to go up, I suppose it makes sense to keep it and all the other games on as many consoles as possible. I think it's an interesting era we're going into overall.
Oh man, it's I mentioned earlier on about Sega, like, having, as old as I am, I remember the downfall of Sega in regards to being a console manufacturer. That idea that you then started seeing Sonic and Mario at the Olympic Games, at those crossover titles, when Sega became a third-party publisher, when the Dreamcast fell, so spectacularly off, that was the only recourse they could have. I think it's an interesting pivot. I welcome the ability for Game Pass and Xbox to greenlight so many games overall. More games for more people, more ideas. I think it restores a foundational element to the industry that, to some degree, various different publishers are getting away from, where everything has to be the biggest bet possible over and over and over again. And you don't get games like Eternal Strands, which just launched on Game Pass right now, or at least it doesn't have the player base that it has right now. Without something like a Game Pass just saying, hey, do you want to try this? Maybe you've seen some footage, go try this thing. There is now the ongoing conversation of subscription models and, monthly recurring spend versus individual unit sales. those are the dividing lines now. Which we talked about plenty of times. This thing goes back a good few years, but it is interesting where almost a year to the day was when Xbox / Phil Spencer mentioned that they were going to bring across Hi-Fi Rush, Pentiment, Sea of Thieves, and another one I'm forgetting onto PlayStation, grounded onto PlayStation. Like I said, almost a year to the day, all the comments from Spencer, we're experimenting with this, maybe we'll do more, we don't know. No, it's everything. Sea of Thieves has been trending in the top 10 for the PlayStation sales for the last year. Clearly there's a hunger here, and at some point all they're going to have to care about is their bottom line. The sanctity of Xbox or whatever just isn't really a thing anymore, and hasn't been, I would argue, for like 10 years. I feel like they've really stumbled from the Xbox One onwards. That was the generation they lost. Spencer's talked about that as well. To throw in though, just to round out the comments from Spencer, you mentioned the hardware side of things. So does he. The fact that obviously when they have games on other consoles, they are paying that platform fee. And he does say that going forward, they're not getting out of the hardware business. They're still going to have an Xbox. Obviously, we make more on our own platform. It's one of the reasons that investing in our own platform is important. We know, again, from all the legal documents that leaked and everything, what the next Xbox is, in theory, unless they change it, it is just an all streaming device. It doesn't have a disc drive on. That's the future of Xbox. It's a Game Pass machine. So it's a little bit different to the Sega thing, but it does remind me of that.
Yeah, and you know what? It makes sense for them to double down on Game Pass now. If you can play everything that Xbox puts out on any console or PC or whatever that you own, it makes sense to have Xbox's kind of exclusive USP be Game Pass, and the message being buy into our ecosystem, buy our machine if you want to get all of these games quote unquote free with a subscription, rather than pay 70 quid a pop if you're playing on PlayStation 5 or Nintendo Switch or whatever. I think it's interesting his phrasing in one of these quotes where he says, we're not trying to get people who play on PlayStation to come over here anymore. And I think that echoes kind of what he's been saying for a while now, even before they made this transition into this kind of third-party approach. You had Phil Spencer saying, like, look, essentially throwing in the towel and saying we're never going to be able to usurp PlayStation as the top hardware shifter in the game, as the top publisher, as the top console maker. And I think at the time, you and I both kind of said, it feels a bit defeatist. Why don't you, double down? Games. Why don't you get those exclusives that turn people's heads? But honestly, at this point, I can see where he's coming from much more.
Right.
Because you look at other, console makers that have stumbled in the past. I saw people pointing out the Wii U and the PlayStation 3, for instance. The PlayStation 3, obviously a major fumble, but it still was it still outsold the Xbox 360 by the end of that generation. The Wii U, obviously a huge stumble, but then you bounce back instantly with the Switch, and then you're back on top again. I think the difference with Xbox is now, their strongest era by far was the 360 era. I think we can say that was generational. Back then, I was an Xbox guy. I preferred the original Xbox over the PS2, and I preferred the 360 over the PS3.
Oh, no!
I know. I have to subscribe to the What Cool Together podcast, so we'll no doubt talk about that in depth at some point. But the point I'm trying to make there is with the 360, that was them firing on all cylinders. That was them taking advantage of the competition stumbling, but also putting out a great product that people liked with exclusives that people wanted to play.
Totally.
And it still didn't win. And then you've had 2 generations since then. So at what point would it even be acceptable for them to keep trying to usurp Sony at their own game? You've had 14 years and kind of like 3 generations trying to do that. True. Would it even be a waste to go into the next generation and commit another 7 or 8 years to the same method when you can't get there? I think it makes sense to shift priorities in a way.
No, man. I think a lot of this, like we mentioned, it comes from the sheer amount of money that had to exchange hands to get the Activision deal over the finish line. That idea that before then, as has been mentioned by so many insiders, Xbox within Microsoft was a rounding error. Jokingly, like the amount of money that Xbox was making comparative to Windows systems and all those transactions was nothing. So the big wigs or whatever at Microsoft just didn't really care what the hell Xbox did. Xbox themselves talk about this in the 20th anniversary documentary that's on their own channel, which I still recommend people watch over on YouTube. But suddenly when that little quote unquote division is asking for $70 billion to do something, then they're on that radar. And we talked about this on the podcast. Josh pointed out like a good few years ago when this stuff started to change. And things had to change internally. And so I do think it's one of those things where, if you want to sell consoles, you invest in exclusives. That's the only place you can play them, and you go from there. Shout out to Colin Moriarty's recent video on this as well over on the Last Stand Media YouTube channel, where he was just pointing out just how far Sony fell on the PlayStation 3, and it was the strength of the exclusives coming out of that resurrected the brand and made everything go back around on the PlayStation 4. The Sony had the same conversation on, do we just get out the industry? We've misspent so much. Yuhei Ishida talked about that since leaving PlayStation as well. But yeah, if you want to sell consoles, you invest in exclusives. If you just want to make a ton of money, you become a third-party publisher and you put as many games as you can everywhere.
And even on top of the actual financials of that deal, I think some of the legal and some of the red tape that came out of it probably also incentivized them to go whole hog and make everything third-party and not an exclusive. If you can't make your biggest games, which I guess now for Microsoft is something like Call of Duty, if you can't make that exclusive and that's not helping you shift consoles because you can't tie it directly to your brand for at least 10 years, at what point are you even allowed to have an exclusive strategy? Because, I don't know, at that point, if your biggest games are going multi-platform, why not everything? Why not Gears if Call of Duty is? Why not Doom if Call of Duty is? And you see in the financial benefit to that, because like I said, you've got this bigger install base. So yeah, I think this has been coming for a while. I think, Phil Spencer, he's doing his best to say it look, this is the new normal. This is kind of, we're doing news on it now, but I don't imagine we'll be doing, we'll see, doing too much going forward on the similar topic, because it's this just is Xbox now. This just is them going forward. And I like to be able to say that. It actually makes me excited for their future, because I do think they have so many great games in the pipeline and of course so many great studios. I am worried about some of those studios and how they fit under this new aggressive growth model. How does an Obsidian fit? How does a Double Fine fit? These kind of smaller, more artistic studios in the face of prioritizing Call of Duty and Overwatch and World of Warcraft and whatnot. Hopefully they can find a place for both of those types of games to exist. But I don't know, I remember being cautiously optimistic about the Activision deal, and then we got all of those layoffs, so I've been wrong before.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff is trying to trim and make the company work. All that stuff kind of came with the pandemic. There was all these different buy-ups that happened across the pandemic. Insane amounts of inflation across the board. I think a lot of the layoffs are because of that. So many different cost-cutting measures as well alongside that stuff. But yeah, ultimately, this is good for gaming in regards to ideas being out.
I've got one more for you. You tried to wrap up the video, but I got one more point that I had in my brain before we started recording. I don't think this is good for Sony, and not because of the fact that, I don't know, they're going multi-platform or whatnot. I think it's bad for Sony because Sony needs competition. Sony is at its worst when it doesn't have direct competition. It cannot just coast by on its laurels and take the piss and assume that it's going to be the top seller. So that's kind of, not to make this Xbox video about PlayStation, slag me up from the comments, but I do think that is a worry, because I think all of the console makers do their best work when they're fighting for the top spot. And if Xbox is throwing in the towel in that regard, I hope someone else kind of rises up that kind of matches Sony and says, listen, you need to be on your A game, you need to compete, you can't take this for granted. Let's go.
It should be the Switch 2, but it depends just how much hardware is in there. Obviously Nintendo have talked a lot about embracing third party going forward. There's going to be so many weird metrics that change, where if you're a major third-party publisher, which ironically now Xbox will be, trying to get your latest Call of Duty or your latest big third-party game to have feature parity on a super-powered PS5 or PS6 and then a Switch 2 or whatever. And I'm putting that below because there's no way in hell Nintendo are trying to compete on the hardware level to that level at all. But going forward, if we're talking about console war stuff and console war conversations, it's going to be Sony versus Nintendo again. It's going to be the late 90s again. And that just is the reality of it. But then it's going to come down to the hardware, and it's going to come down to where are those games available. So far, Sony and Nintendo are still playing the exclusive game, which is working very well for them. But yeah, we'll see going forward. For now, Xbox are changing everything.